national network, there is no universally accepted definition for the term disabled. And the definition used makes a tremendous difference in how many people are counted or excluded. Again, my name is Melodie I am 17 years old and weigh approximately 85 pounds, depending on what I've eaten. In the summer of 2005, my life took a drastic turn. At the doctor's appointment that led to the series of events I now call my life, my 4-year-old mind was incapable of comprehending the gravity of the situation I was to face. But I soon understood the effects of that appointment later that day. My family gathered around me like scientists waiting to see the effects of a drug on some kind of lab rat. The first prescribed medication I took was called Prednisone, usually the first choice prescribed for patients suffering from inflammatory issues. The first thing I understood was how disgusting it was. I spat it out on the plate in front of me right before my parents laughed, and then they told me that I needed to keep taking this daily until I was told otherwise. Up until that point, I hadn't cared as much about the doctor's appointments or even when I knew my mom was going to pick up my meds at Walgreens. I thought it was all as temporary as a common cold. But it was in this moment that I understood that the effects of that appointment were not temporary. In fact, I'm still living with them today. Because of that appointment that day, I was diagnosed with juvenile dermatomyositis, or JDM for short. I know it's a mouthful. Up until then, like most patients with JDM, I'd acquired the common rashes and noticeable signs of muscle weakness. It's hard enough for the average child to be told what to do, but it's harder when you don't get that choice. Your body won't allow it. So at recess, most children play games like hide and seek, run races, and tag. As a person who's dealt with consistent muscle weakness on a consistent basis, you wonder if you lose a race not because there was room for improvement, but because you were predisposed to. The muscle weakness was challenging to endure, yes, but it was manageable. The hardest thing for me to deal with has been the calcinosis, a fancy term for bumps made of calcium. They protrude from my skin, usually hard calcium, as well as maintaining a presence beneath my skin, soft calcium. In my younger years, they usually ooze liquid calcium. While I've always been able to lie and say I was fine if asked if I was in pain, the calcinosis have always been the more challenging part of my illness to hide. In first grade, I learned how true this fact was. Due to the warm weather, I'd opted out of wearing a long sleeve shirt, because I didn't want to be hot and sweaty. And still new to having bumps and marks mar my arms, I had completely forgotten that I had something to hide. I was made aware of this fact when in gym class there was about a foot-wide gap on either side of me because my peers thought that I was contagious. And as intelligent as my peers were for even knowing what that meant at that age, they forgotten that if I was contagious, I wouldn't be allowed to attend public school. Between putting on a brave face physically to show that I wasn't as weak as I probably was physically, and trying to build my strength mentally, I had a hard time making friends my age. I wanted to tell no one that I could get pummeled to a pulp, not because I was the shortest person in my grade, but because I suffered from a potentially chronic illness. And it wasn't one that everyone had really known could harm or probably kill you, like cancer, but it was something no one had ever really heard of before. So I was ashamed, isolated, and an outcast. The only place I felt I belonged to, which I really wanted nothing to do with, was a hospital. Before, when my mom had encouraged me to advocate for myself by referring to myself not as diseased, but as a person suffering from limitations or having disabilities, I'd still been too ashamed to even have thoughts of communicating to others what was really going on with me. While in the past I'd been called many names in relation to the illness I have, it wasn't until I was in about 6th grade that I'd been labeled as disabled. With this term generally comes a sense of disdain, disgust, rejection, etc. Nothing linked to a positive thought process. It was in 6th grade that I'd gotten personal with this term. That year I'd had a flare-up, which is when an illness shows an increased amount of activity after having plateaued for a while. It was a Friday night. I was ready to recuperate from the long week that all middle schoolers go through. And I was laying in bed when I began to get thirsty, and I found myself trying to get out of bed When I felt a weight, I felt a pain I had not felt in quite a while. The calcinosis had began to build a pressure so strong in my knee that I experienced several tiny fractures throughout my bone. At school, I had a rolling book bag because I couldn't carry one on my back. So, unlike the average person who would use crutches during the healing process, I had to be wheeled around in a chair for the whole school to see during that process, an idea that I was wholly against. I knew that on a day-to-day basis, I usually experienced a crueler side to humanity. So I knew the challenge I faced then would certainly not be met by kindness from a majority of my peers. In that time, I'd received a temporarily disabled decal. In public, I began to pay more attention to those whom I saw in a wheelchair. And one day when I was in Walmart grocery shopping with Mom, I'd seen a man with no legs. He was minding his own business, wheeling himself around in his chair, grocery shopping like any other person. And this was truly amazing to me, because even though people kept looking and staring at him, he seemed as if he didn't care. It was a normal day, he just continued about his business. Whereas whenever I was out in public in the chair, I'd feel very self-conscious. I kept my head down. I didn't want to see that people were staring. I didn't want to hear the little kids whisper and point. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted everyone to just ignore me and go on about their day. It gotten so bad to the point that I didn't even really want to go out in public anymore, let alone grocery shopping. And every kid wants to go grocery shopping to get their favorite snack or food for the week. Unlike with calcinosis, I couldn't just throw on a long-sleeve shirt over a chair and call it a day. I had wondered how that man could ignore everyone paying attention to him. I had wondered if it just came with experience. Is it something you just become acclimated to? Did he actively ignore those people? I wanted his trick. While in this position, I'd often think back to elementary school. There were a group of students overtly labeled as special education kids. They were placed in a separate classroom, although they would occasionally join us. And while my experiences were unpleasant, this group of children especially suffered harsher consequences for their differences. So, above all, the person who probably could relate to their experience the most wanted nothing to do with them. While I may not have joined in on the teasing and the mocking on most occasions, I certainly didn't stick up for this group of people whom I shared more in common with, because I so very much desired to belong to the group of humans bullying them. How could I, a person having a disability, expect anyone to stand by my side and stick up for me when I wasn't willing to stick up for my own? In this way, I was a hypocrite. But this very fear of being called out for my flaws is what allowed me to see that the bullies probably felt the same way. And it was then that I thought that a person didn't have to be disabled in the conventional way. It was in junior high that I had started really grasping this concept, but high school was when I really got to the meat of this meaning. Sophomore year, the group of friends I usually had hung around for the past couple of years all decided that it'd be a great idea to just up and each one of them go to a different school. So once again, I was alone. But it's when you're alone that the most self-reflection can happen. So I got to self-reflecting. According to Carla Thompson, there's a very strong relationship between depression and disabilities. We often go through common everyday issues that any other person would experience, as well as experience additional barriers on top of that. And it can often be challenging to learn how to deal with and speak up for yourself in dealing with these barriers. In my high school experience, I have had to advocate more for myself than I have in my entire 17 years of life. And before that, I'd always had my mom who would really push for me in getting my IEP and getting everything together. So it was a shock for me coming to high school and having to become more independent. It was hard. So anyways, back to high school, I had to begin to learn to push for myself. A few of the barriers we faced, as stated by Ms. Thompson, includes mobility, accessibility, and the social barrier / isolation. It was this past October that I was able to share the difficulties I faced with this, as well as hear a few solutions to these issues. I was nominated to not only attend, but to be placed on a student panel for the 12th Annual Statewide Transition Conference. This conference is held with the goal of enlightening others, especially educators, and how to further develop transition programs for those with disabilities. The intent is to build a safe and successful environment for those with disabilities and coming to high school. My personal transition into high school was not a good one. The adversity I faced, however, helped build my character. And it was because I was placed in situations like the ones that I faced with not only students in handling my disability, but staff as well, that I was able to share my story and constructive criticism and how to fix these errors at the conference. I and about 12 other students were asked questions in which we were able to relate to each other in the adversity we faced and the challenges we've overcome. The day arrived, October 19, 2018, and as it progressed, I saw more educators and more students with disabilities, and it was a truly humbling experience to see others who had gone through a similar, if not worse, position or experience than I have. The questions that we were asked generally focused on the barriers we've encountered in our situations throughout high school and how we've dealt with them. Many on the panel, similar to myself, were able to express the challenges faced with self-advocacy, though some had more than others. We were all able to discuss how there had been moments when some, whether staff or students, doubted our disability or denied us of accommodations for various reasons. Some due to the challenge it took to acquire an IEP, which is an individualized education program, in order to have access to these accommodations. Some because the staff declined to give us what was already fought for and won because we didn't know how to come to them about it. And the staff lacked the empathy and compassion to understand our disposition, etc. Plus the transition programs in place for students like us. And this is where I discovered a lack. About 1/3 of the students placed on the panel mostly had great things to speak of in relation to the programs their schools had in place for them. They felt as if they had already come into a safe and welcoming environment, and their opinion had not changed since. This left me to ponder what the differences were between them and myself. Their schools provided work-study programs specifically for students with disabilities, mentoring programs within the school like Big Brother, Big Sister, programs led and made for these students, as well as proactive student bodies and councils geared for fixing and advocating for issues students with disabilities might encounter. They described their environments as very welcoming. They felt as if they could go to almost any staff or administrator about any issues, if any, experienced. The school community retained empathy for one another, and it showed. One of the final questions that we were asked is, what advice, if any, could we give to parents, staff, and others like us? So for the parents, please listen closely. I understand that it's challenging to do this, but you need to learn to let go. There won't always be a time where you can catch us when we fall. And if we cannot learn to become independent in a controlled environment, how are we expected to do so in a place where there is no cushion? For the educators, listen closely. I understand that while in high school we're expected to be becoming more and more self-sufficient, sometimes we need a push in the right direction and sometimes we need a break. I know it's very hard to understand someone who's different from you, and as much as teachers may try, they might never understand it. So if we actually do work up the courage to come to you, to put our pride on the line, to talk to you about something that trusts us, we don't want to disclose in a normal situation, please don't shoot us down. From a young age, we're taught to fear our differences, a fear of the unknown, one could say. Worse, it's become so much of a stigma to address these differences that they often go ignored or unnoticed until it's too late. So these unaddressed feelings and emotions simmer until they are developed into something beyond unpleasant, especially in relation to those who are looked upon as being inferior to general society. These people that we find to be a burden to the rest of society, that we deem inferior to ourselves, that we say are substandard and far from the norm, are called many names. But there's one in particular that I'm familiar with, and that's disabled. A negative connotation becomes attached to those whom we define as such, or those owning a disability. The more distinctive the disability, the more of an outcast this person with the disability becomes. I myself have experienced both sides of this coin. I've been both the victim and the bystander. Like my mother used to tell me, your disabilities, your limitations don't define who you are. But what I've later come to find out myself is that they do shape who you become. It is how we face adversity and how we meet our challenges that determine what kind of person we are to be. I found the social barrier to be most problematic for me. I was judged, ridiculed, and outcasted for my disability, especially in my younger years. However, it was because of this that I was able to be molded into the strong young person who stands before you today. It is in our differences that we find what makes us special, and that allows us to learn from others. Even so, it's often in sharing what we think to be our differences that we find something to relate to others about and extend inclusion for everyone. So I encourage you to be different and to be proud of it. Own every part of yourself, the good and what others may find to be not so good. And in doing so, we learn to own ourselves and include others. So what does it mean to be disabled? It means to be like any other different person. So what's your disability? Find it, own it. Thank you.